Welcome everyone. Thank you for coming tonight and attending this Nuisance Wildlife Seminar. And thank you to the people on Zoom. Our speaker tonight is Robin Phenes. She is a wildlife biologist for the DEC.
Quick one, got it. No, you're good.
Our guest speaker tonight is Robin Phenes. She's a wildlife biologist for the DEC's Bureau of Wildlife, and she's currently working out of the Bath office. She has an associate's degree in natural resources from Finger Lakes Community College. She has a BS in biology and psychology from Eckerd College and a master's from wildlife science, master's in wildlife science from Cornell University. And she's been working for the DEC Bureau of Wildlife on and off since 1998. And her specialty is large animals. And I saw, looking this up, you helped do a management plan for deer in Rochester, and have been on television too. So welcome, and we look forward to your presentation tonight.
Thank you everyone for the invite tonight, and hello to everybody who's watching from home as well. I told the folks here I'm not too used to working on Zoom meetings, so I'll try to be attentive to everybody that's at home, and hopefully you'll have the opportunity to ask questions as well. So first I want to thank Patty for inviting me here tonight. You know, it's kind of been a long presentation in the making, because we tried to do this, I think, back in last year, and things got shifted around. So I'm happy to be here tonight. And I also wanted to thank John Connolly for putting together this nice poster to advertise the presentation. I think it's a very good depiction of some of the topics that we're going to discuss tonight. So thank you. Let's see here. What I'll be talking about is basically what do we do when the wildlife we love start to become pests. So some of the questions that I'm going to be answering today as I work through the presentation is, why are we having more encounters with wildlife in general? What are homeowners doing to contribute to the problems that we're having with wildlife? And what is the role of DEC in the management of wildlife? That's a question that we get frequently. What problems does DEC not handle when it comes to wildlife? And then how can residents handle problem encounters with wildlife on their own? And then what resources are there for sick and injured wildlife? So hopefully by the end of this presentation, I will have answered all those questions for everyone. So the first question, why are wildlife encounters increasing? Well, we have to look at the broad picture here. And one of the main reasons is just human population growth in general, right? If there's more people around, there's obviously going to be more encounters with wildlife. So I have this picture on the right there, that's of Lakeville in the northern part of Canisius Lake, and you can see all the homes, the businesses that are in that area. And I grew up in Livonia. I graduated from Livonia High School, and I can think back to when I was a kid, and there definitely wasn't all of this development. Homes have popped up, businesses have popped up all over the place. So, you know, it's just natural that more people, more encounters with wildlife. Another reason is just with the increased human population comes more of that development, whether it be commercial development, residential, even industrial in some of the areas. I mean, you think you drive down to Geneseo and look at all the changes that have happened there, or up toward Henrietta. This whole area is being developed. Not at a super fast rate, but fast enough where it's impacting the wildlife habitat where the development is happening. And again, this is just a zoomed in aerial photograph of Lakeville itself, and you can see how developed it is. And I found this nice picture that I think actually talks about the problem like really well. Things are not always as they seem. This deer isn't really crossing the road is crossing the forest, right? That used to be the forest years ago, and now it's a road that's encroached on the habitat of wildlife, and wildlife has had to adapt, and we have to adapt to the wildlife as well. So another reason wildlife encounters are increasing is just the suburban or residential habitat in general. Even though the development is taking away some of the natural habitats, suburbia itself provides really good habitat for a lot of species. One in particular is white-tailed deer. They thrive in suburban habitats. When we think about the manicured lawns that are fertilized and provide a lot of nutrients, the landscaping plants and flowers that deer love to feed on, I mean, it's perfect habitat for these populations to thrive in. You can see in some of the homes and some of the architecture we see nowadays, there's a lot of nooks and crannies in the structure of the homes themselves that provide a lot of places for wildlife to get into and hide and maybe cause problems. And so, you know, just the buildings and the structures themselves provide good wildlife habitat. So that's why some of the wildlife encounters are increasing. Another reason is that people are unintentionally feeding wildlife. We do things that we aren't even thinking about as attracting wildlife. And you can see from some of these pictures here, just some of the innocent things like the park here that we're at tonight. I'm sure there's garbage cans around, right? People don't always carry in and carry out their garbage wherever they go. And when they leave those in the garbage cans, it naturally attracts wildlife and causes more interest. Bird feeders are another big one that I'll talk a little bit more about later, but they attract many species that, you know, we put them out intentionally to feed the birds, but we're not thinking about all the other species that we're bringing into the bird feeders. And then certainly when people are feeding their pets, they're not always thinking about the negative encounters that can result from that. So that's another reason we're seeing more encounters with wildlife. When we think about the bigger picture over a longer time frame too, just the fact that we don't have the natural predators, the large natural predators here in the Northeast that we used to have years ago, particularly for the control of white-tailed deer. So things like cougars and wolves that used to be here years ago have just been extirpated. Now, they're not something that we certainly want back, just because there's no habitat here for them now. But years ago, this was, you know, what kept populations in check, but we just don't have that anymore. And then we have fewer mid-sized predators as well. So even though we are seeing more coyotes, maybe more bobcat and fisher on the landscape, they're still not at the numbers where they're in balance with some of the prey populations. So they're not completely keeping those populations of the smaller animals like woodchuck, squirrels, all of those species in check. So we have to think about that too. We don't always like to see the predators, but there's an important ecological balance there. And then another reason we see a lot of wildlife encounters is because there's limited hunting and trapping in a lot of these suburban and residential areas. Not to the extent that we used to see years ago, and certainly with more development, it limits the opportunities for hunting and trapping. Without the natural predators, you know, preying on those wildlife populations, we need to have some type of control of these species. Otherwise, we're just going to continue to see encounters and negative ones, unfortunately. So our second question is, how are homeowners themselves contributing to these problems? I mentioned a little bit more, or a little about bird feeders before, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about that. I mean, again, they're something that we put out because we enjoy feeding the birds, yet we know squirrels come to bird feeders. They kick the seeds all out onto the ground. And when the seeds are on the ground, here come the mice, the voles, the rats sometimes. And that's an attractant for the fox, the coyotes, the larger predators. So it's just this, you know, succession of things that happen. I talked to a family the other day in Steuben County. They are having a problem with a bear. And the husband, his wife loves to watch the birds, so they don't want to pull their bird feeders in completely, even though that's what we're recommending. So he goes out, he leaves plastic out under the bird feeder every morning when he puts it up. When the seed falls out at night, when he goes to bring the bird feeder in, he cleans up the plastic so there's no bird seed scattered around to attract the mice. And I'm like, okay, if you're not willing to bring in your bird feeder completely, I guess that's a good solution. But it was kind of cute. So anyway, these are some of the other species that these bird feeders will attract. And when you start to see more fox in your yard or the coyotes in the neighborhood, sometimes this is the reason why, just because the bird feeders are there providing the food source. Another way that homeowners are contributing is feeding their pets outside. So I know a lot of us probably had dogs and cats and we let them out in the yard. And if we feed them outside, that's fine if you're right there supervising them. But what becomes problematic is when you leave the food out there overnight or for extended periods of time. You're just providing an easy meal for raccoons, fox, even the coyotes that we are seeing more of around the area. So we definitely have to be conscientious of that. I just saw this product, the dog bowls, that actually hook right to the fencing, and it's beautiful. It's a great product, but I think, oh no, that's just encouraging people to leave their food out there for their animals. So just we have to be cognizant of that and remove our pet food. Another way we're contributing is by leaving our pets out unsupervised. So, you know, a lot of us probably have fenced in yards where we let our dog run, or sometimes maybe an invisible fence where the dog might get a shock if they go beyond a certain point, but the wildlife don't get that shock. So they can come into your invisible fence and interact with your animals. Here's another example where someone was feeding their cat in the backyard and a fox just happened to come by and get an easy meal, and then has the potential to, you know, possibly have a negative interaction with that cat. So our pets are extensions of us, and you know, we certainly want to protect them. So I always recommend to folks that if they're letting their pets outside, that they do so in a supervised way when possible. Another thing that we love to do, right, is have gardens in our yards. So whether it's a vegetable garden or a flower garden, these things are very big attractants to wildlife. So we have to really be thinking about the types of things we're planting. If we're insistent on having a garden and we know there could be potentials with problems with wildlife, we want to make sure we're protecting our investment and our time that we're putting into these things. I just got a call from a colleague of mine whose neighbors are having problems with deer in their neighborhood. And unfortunately, they live right next to a state park, so there's no hunting in the state park, which increases the population of deer. And she told me that one of her neighbors just spent, I think, $500 on flowers to make her yard look beautiful, and it did for about a day or two. And a group of 10 deer came through and basically decimated her garden in a day. So she's like heartbroken over all the work and the money that she spent. But it's a real problem, and they're trying to figure out ways to get that under control, which might be talking with the state park and implementing some hunting in there to keep the population down. Sometimes those are the solutions that you have to work with. Another thing that really causes negative encounters with wildlife is garbage and recycling bins. So oftentimes we keep garbage outside in a plastic bin. Sometimes it's closed, but not everybody does that, right? Sometimes the garbage is left out, very accessible to wildlife. Another thing that people don't think about is the recycling bins too. Even if you're washing out your recyclables, it's still food residue. And if those are left outside, that can be just as big of an attractant as a garbage bin. And you can see, I mean, that's a bear getting into the garbage. We don't see bears up here in Lakeville and northern Livingston County very often, but they're here for sure. I've gotten plenty of calls from people with apiaries, beekeepers, with problems, bears getting into their hives. So even though they're not here in big numbers now, this is something that we're all going to have to be thinking about down the road as the bear population gets bigger. Even if it's not bears, raccoons have just as much tendency to get into garbage cans as bears do. So folks need to be conscientious about that, keep their garbage cans inside a garage if possible, or just put the garbage out the night before pickup, or I'm sorry, the morning of pickup instead of the night before, because that just reduces the number of hours the animals have to get into that garbage. Another way homeowners are contributing to problems with wildlife is by not keeping their homes in good repair. So this could be just a tiny hole that you've noticed that you just haven't gotten around to fixing. Well, that little hole in a shed or in your roof can instantly be an entryway for squirrels, for bats, for raccoons even. So you want to make sure that everything's being, buttoned up and kept in good repair so that you don't have bat problems in your attic or the squirrels nesting. Those are some common sense things, but sometimes things that, just go by the wayside and can cause problems for people. And finally, one way that we're contributing is just enjoying our own backyards, right? We cook out in the summertime. We have all these delicious food smells out there. People don't often think that once they're done cooking, the smell of that food is still on their barbecue grills. A simple solution for that is just to turn up the heat on that grill, cook off all of the remnant fluids, make sure that grill's cleaned off, and clean out the grease trap. It'll prevent a lot of animals from being attracted to it, and you keep your yard clean and scent free and reduce any problem encounters with wildlife. And again, we don't have this situation here yet, but so many people in the southern tier have bear problems because of their grilling practices. Just 2 people this week I've talked to about smokers. They have, the small smokers now, they've been smoking meat, and both people had problems with bears getting on their back porches because of it. So again, things to think about. So another question that comes up frequently is, what is DEC's role in wildlife management in general? So I put up here the mission of the Bureau of Wildlife. So it's really to provide the people of New York the opportunity to enjoy all the benefits of wildlife of the state now and in the future. This shall be accomplished through scientifically sound management of wildlife species in a manner that is efficient, clearly described, consistent with law, and in harmony with public need. So there's a lot to absorb there, but in general, we have, I think, 15 wildlife staff in Region 8. So Region 8 covers 11 counties, basically from Lake Ontario down to the Pennsylvania border. So there's only 15 full-time permanent wildlife staff. Now we do have law enforcement officers as well, usually about 2 per county. So they help with a lot of wildlife issues. But generally our wildlife staff is looking at broader picture, like population management level things. We conduct scientific research on all the species, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, birds. We work with universities to accomplish a lot of this research. And mostly that's, to get a good handle on where our population levels are. Are they increasing, decreasing? Do we need to implement hunting seasons or trapping seasons, or reduce hunting and trapping if populations are getting low? So that's kind of the level that we're looking at the DEC. We have laws that protect threatened and endangered species. We do a lot of monitoring of wildlife diseases to prevent the spread. One big one that's kind of on the forefront of our minds is chronic wasting disease in deer. It's in the deer population out west, it's in Pennsylvania. We're worried about it coming to New York because it could decimate the deer population. So we're monitoring that. There's other zoonotic diseases, which means they're transmissible to humans. So we certainly want to keep those types of diseases on our radar. Because, the implications for human health in those situations. We manage a lot of state lands in the region for wildlife habitat. I think we have upwards of 20,000 acres that we manage just for wildlife. And then there's other state forests that are managed basically for tree growth, but wildlife live there, so certainly we also manage that for wildlife habitat. We use laws and regulations to protect both wildlife and their habitats. We're also educating and informing the public about various components of wildlife, just like I'm doing here tonight. And then finally, if there's problems with wildlife species, we can issue nuisance permits to help people with their individual problems. But again, we're mostly looking at those broader population level wildlife situations, not necessarily individual animals that are causing problems. So another question is, what does DEC not do when it comes to wildlife? And one thing we don't do is trap and remove animals from people's yards or their homes. I cannot tell you how many calls we get in the office every year. I just saw a coyote walk through my yard. You have to come right now and trap this problem animal. So I like talked them. I'm like, well, what's happening? What did you see? And they said, well, it just walked through my yard. Okay, that's not really a problem. It might be unsettling because you're not used to seeing the coyote. It's unexpected, but the animal's just doing what it does. It's just being wildlife, right? So we, try to talk to people, educate them, and distinguish when it is a true problem and when it's not. Certainly, if that coyote was becoming bold, starting to be aggressive toward a person or a child or a pet, then we would take a different approach. But if it's just an animal walking through a yard, we're not necessarily going to do anything about that at that point. We get a lot of calls in the spring about fox denning under people's porches or under their sheds. And again, that's not something DEC is going to come out and help with. We'll make recommendations to the landowners how to help alleviate that or discourage them from being there. Again, part of that could be maintaining your shed, making sure there's no holes underneath for the animals to get under and create the den. Simple things like that can go a long way for preventing those problems. We also do not remove animals from traps. So a lot of people do try to take the wildlife situation into their own hands, but they're not thinking about what happens when they actually catch the animal that's eating their vegetables. I had a man from Rochester call me last year. He said, "Ma'am, you have to come up here right away and remove this skunk I just trapped." I had to chuckle a little bit. I said, well, DEC doesn't do that. And he said, what do you mean? The city of Rochester used to do it. And he was all confused, and I directed him to some people that could help, but it's a misconception about what DEC staff does with wildlife. And I always tell people, the second you set a trap, you have to know your game plan for any species that you get in that trap. A lot of people don't know that it's illegal to remove animals they trap from their property and take them somewhere else and release them. That's illegal to do in New York. So they think they can just take it to the nearest state land and let it go there. But all that does is create a problem on the state land or at the neighbors next to the state land. So that it's illegal for folks to do that. Another thing that we don't do is relocate nuisance wildlife for just that reason I told you. If it's causing a problem on somebody's property, relocating it to another area is just going to cause a problem somewhere else. So we just don't do that. And we don't typically rescue injured or orphaned animals. Occasionally we'll respond to situations, or our officers will, to help. An officer responded to this situation where a hawk was caught in a picnic table in a park, and he was able to just flip the table and the hawk was able to get out. But typically we don't respond to this type of call. But fortunately, we do provide licenses to wonderful people who can help in these situations. And I'll talk about those different categories of people in a minute. So a few tips to help people prevent wildlife conflicts at their homes is, an easy way to remember that is with the acronym REPEL. Okay. So REPEL stands for, the R is remove food sources. So we talked about that. bird feeders, pet food, barbecue grills, garbage cans, all those things. If you remove them, you're reducing the chance of any wildlife conflicts on your property. If you eliminate eliminate, the cover and shelter, you're taking away one of the things that wildlife need to survive, right? So they're going to be less likely to be on your property. So this can be as simple as like cutting down some of the brush that's on the back part of your lawn, or, you know, if you have a bigger property, you can remove some of the brushy areas around the part that you actually live in. Any types of, you know, sheds that are in disrepair that they can get into for protection, those types of things. If you eliminate that, you reduce the chance of wildlife conflict. The P in repel stands for put up barriers. So again, if you have like a garden that you're trying to protect, you simply put an exclusionary fence around your garden so that the animals can't get in. That's the barrier you're putting up to protect your garden. The E in repel stands for excite or agitate. So for example, this just means making noise or using a light motion light where the animal comes near your home, the light's triggered, scares the animal off. That can work, you know, sometimes successfully, sometimes they get used to it and become acclimated to it, so it might not be a long-term solution, but anything you can do to make them uncomfortable being near your home and in your yard is going to reduce the chance that you're going to have a conflict with that animal. And then finally, the L stands for legally remove or take. So if any of these other methods aren't working, there are mechanisms for legal removal of those animals. And that can be through, you know, hiring someone to do it, doing it yourself. But anytime wildlife is damaging your property, you have the right to remove an animal from your property. If they're causing a nuisance, you need to get a permit from DEC most times in order to remove a nuisance animal. So it's a tiny distinction, but an important one. So people often ask, like, how do we handle wildlife conflicts if they were to happen? And I put the worst case scenarios up here first, because I want to emphasize that if something like this is happening, call 911 right away. Like, this is a serious situation. You hear something rustling in your house at night and you go home to find a bear on your counter, call 911, get out of the house and call 911. 911 dispatch will get in touch with DEC officers, they'll involve wildlife staff, and we can handle a situation like this. If you ever get bitten or scratched by any type of wildlife, you need to get medical attention right away, especially if it was a mammal, because any mammal can carry rabies, and we certainly would want your healthcare providers to talk with the local health department and come up with an appropriate post-exposure treatment if there's a chance that the animal was rabid. This poor lady was attacked by a fox in her garden. This happened in Ithaca, I think a couple of years ago, or maybe last year. But yeah, she was just working in her garden, and this fox came right up to her and started attacking her. Luckily, her neighbor was there, was able to get the fox away from her. But it's a scary situation and something that can come up like very quickly. So I encourage people to be very vigilant when you're out in your yards. If you see something suspicious, especially a sick acting animal that is a rabies suspect animal, get help right away. For a lot of other conflicts, I think the very first thing is actually to determine if there's a true problem to begin with. Like I mentioned, the people that are calling just saying a fox just walked through my yard or a coyote's in my neighbor's lawn, those are real problems. Like the real problems happen when those animals are aggressive or if they're damaging property. So to begin with, you can educate yourself. There's a ton of resources on the internet anymore where you can look up problems with a specific animal and get very detailed information of what to do. And most of the time, you can handle it yourself. Like people are very capable of doing much of this. And in the situations where you can't do it yourself, there's folks that you can hire to help you. And that's who I'll talk about now. These are nuisance wildlife control operators, or NUCOs for short. they're licensed in New York State, but NUCOs are around the country as well. There's actually a national training program for NUCOs. It's very widespread. This is actually a training manual for NUCOs. I brought along just so you can see like how thick and thorough it is. They have to know pretty much all the habitats of all of the wildlife species that could cause problems around people's homes and around commercial buildings. They have to know the different methods to help alleviate the problems that those wildlife species are causing. So it's a very rigorous training process that they have to go through. They have to take an exam in New York State to get licensed, and they have to pass the exam, obviously. Then they pay a fee to get their license, and I believe it's an annual fee. So they have to, you know, keep their training up regularly. Because they pay, they're going to be working on your property or, you know, commercial properties. They carry liability insurance, and most of them run this as a business. Okay, nuisance wildlife control operators are a business entity. So anytime you have someone coming in to do work on your home, this wouldn't be any different than if you hired somebody to work on your bathroom or put in a kitchen floor or pave your driveway. You would call around and get some price quotes. I always recommend you do the same if you were to hire a nuisance wildlife control operator to help with wildlife problems on your property. Some of the things that nuisance wildlife control operators will do. I gave the example of fox denning under a porch before. These photos were taken by Phil West, who's actually a nuisance wildlife control operator right in Phenes. But he trapped all the fox out from under that deck, and then he was able to put that exclusion fence around to prevent the fox from getting back in there either that year or in future years. So it's pretty much a permanent fix at this point. He's going to charge the landowner to do that, but you know, he's solved the problem there. There's not going to be any more wildlife conflicts under that porch. So nuisance wildlife control operators are really going to try to remove that animal that's causing the problem and then exclude it from getting in there again. Another thing that nuisance wildlife control operators really focus on is preventing any wildlife encounters. So they're going to encourage folks to put up fences, or they might help install fences. I just talked to a nuisance wildlife control operator the other day who was interested in helping beekeepers put up electric fences around their apiaries. He was also just interested in helping with other types of electric fence in different scenarios around chicken coops, even around people's gardens, things like that. So there's a lot of different avenues that these nuisance wildlife control operators can help landowners with wildlife problems. Another one is just habitat modification. Like I mentioned before, keeping brushy areas cut down, your grass mowed, so there's not places for wildlife species to hide and to be comfortable in around your residence or on your farms. So those are some of the things that nuisance wildlife control operators are going to be dealing with. So how do you find a nuisance wildlife control operator in your area? The DEC has a website where you can just search for find NUCOs in my location. And you can, a search screen will come up where you can pick what county you live in. You can search by county and then you'll get a whole list. So I picked Livingston County, that's where we are. And I think there's 11 NUCOs that came up. So these are currently licensed nuisance wildlife control operators. Again, this list is available right on the DEC website. Just if you had a wildlife problem and you called a couple of these people, you didn't like what they had to tell you, you didn't like their prices, maybe you could go to a different county and try to find somebody else. So there's lots of options for nuisance wildlife control operators. The next question is, what resources are there for sick and injured wildlife? So just say you found a bird that fell out of a tree and broke its wing in your yard. You're pretty certain that bird cannot fly, it's not going to recover on your own. While DEC also licenses wonderful people called wildlife rehabilitators. These folks have taken it upon themselves to learn the basic first aid, I guess you could say, for wildlife. You know, they're not veterinarians, but they're members of the public who really want to help individual animals recover and hopefully be released back to the wild. Again, these folks are licensed by DEC, so they have to again go through a training process. There's training materials online, then they have to take an exam, and then usually they do the wildlife rehabilitation at their home. So they get a site inspection to make sure their facilities are appropriate for taking care of wildlife. And once they pass the inspection and pass their exam, they can be licensed. They do have to pay a fee to get licensed. And an important thing to know about wildlife rehabilitators is they're complete volunteers. They don't get paid to do this, except for we do have the Janet L. Swanson Wildlife Health Center, which is through Cornell University. And there's a wildlife veterinarian there and their staff. And they're a fantastic resource right in Ithaca, so it's not too far from many of our other wildlife rehabilitators. If they run into problems they can't deal with the individual animals, they can always take them there. But most of the rehabbers are complete volunteers. They rely on donations from the public, and they don't get any state funding to help with the food or the cages or any of the veterinary care. So it's really, you know, they put their heart and soul into helping to, you know, nurse these animals back to good health and get them so they can be released back to the wild. I also tell folks that if you find an injured or sick animal that needs to go to a rehabber, there's not a lot of rehabbers around and they may not be able to take the animal that you want, whether it's they don't deal with those particular species or they're just filled to capacity. Especially during the spring season when there's so many babies around, people are picking them up and taking them to the rehabber, so they get filled up very quickly and it's hard to find space sometimes. So unfortunately, sometimes the best thing to do is just leave the animal there. I know it's heartbreaking sometimes, especially for folks that really want to help these animals, but just letting nature take its course sometimes is the most humane thing we can do. The likelihood of the animals being rehabbed and being able to be released is sometimes low anyway, so it's just something to keep in mind. You can also find wildlife rehabilitators near you by going to our DEC website, searching for wildlife rehabilitators. Again, you can search by county, and you can also search by the various species. And the categories that rehabbers work under are bats, raccoons, and skunks. Those have special consideration because they're rabies vector species. That means they're most likely to carry rabies. So the people handling those for rehabilitation purposes have to have some special training in order to be able to do that. Because of that, there's very few of them in New York State. So when somebody picks up an injured raccoon and expects to find somebody that can take care of it, it's really difficult to find a facility for those raccoons to go to. Some rehabbers specialize in just small mammals. Others work with large animals, and that's deer and black bear. We actually only have 2 facilities in New York State that can rehabilitate black bear cubs. Some specialize in just reptiles and amphibians. Others do songbirds. Others do raptors, game birds, waterfowl, and all other birds. So you can see these rehabbers can really specialize in certain groups of species. And again, it kind of helps distribute the workload for all these folks, but then it makes it a little more difficult to find a generalist who can take basically any species that might be injured. And again, you can search, I think I mentioned, by animal group or by county or both, if you need to find somebody. So that was rehabbers for sick and injured wildlife. For orphan wildlife, if you were to find an animal that you were certain has lost its parents, then in that situation, you could take them to a wildlife rehabilitator as well. However, most often, when people think the animals are orphaned, they're really not, right? So fawns especially, for some reason, people cannot comprehend that the doe is not with the fawn 24 hours a day. She is off feeding, she's getting energy because, you know, she has to produce milk to feed that fawn. And she's not with that baby very much at all. And actually, the fawn is just laying there very still. That's their method of protection. And the second people see that, they think it's an orphaned fawn or abandoned, and they don't wait enough time for that doe to come back and take care of it. So they scoop it up, take it off, and then the rehabbers just get inundated with small fawns. And then at that point, they can't be reunited with their mom usually. So it's a heartbreaking situation. I try to convince people to leave them for several days. If they still are unattended at that point, then it would be okay to take the animal to a rehabilitator. Make sure they're orphaned before you pick it up. And you know, we provide press release every year. If you care, leave them there. We try to get the word out to folks that most wildlife is not orphaned or abandoned when you find a baby. It's just waiting for its mom or to come back and feed it. So there are some problems that aren't necessarily just at the individual residence level, but can become a more community-wide problem. And one of the species that I work with, the white-tailed deer, can often be a community-wide problem, right? So you think about a municipality where there's a lot of houses in close proximity to each other. No hunting is allowed, mostly because of discharge ordinances that prevent discharge of firearms or bows and crossbows. So there's really no mechanism for controlling the population when there's, you know, residential development and decent human population in a small area. So oftentimes the community leaders will get together and say, you know, or someone from the community will say, hey, there are way too many deer here. We really need to do something about it. And then they'll get together with their town officials and initiate a deer control program. And that can be, it can run a whole bunch of different scenarios. It can be as simple as just trying to encourage landowners to do different landscape plantings that aren't going to attract the deer. Because maybe that's what the main complaint is in a community, is just the landscape plants are being browsed, right? So if you can protect the plants, maybe the deer aren't so much of a problem. Some communities have vehicle accidents, so they might limit their speed limits in certain areas where the accidents are prone to happening. If communities want to step it up a little, they can consider hunting programs. Usually it's people that are vetted beforehand before they're allowed to hunt, so they're given proficiency tests with archery equipment. Usually in these communities, firearms discharge is not allowed, so it usually is bows and crossbows that are used to control the deer population. And oftentimes all the venison is donated to a local food pantry. It makes the program a little more palatable to people who might not be as supportive of hunting per se. But usually, you know, these communities are required to write a deer management plan before they implement a community-wide program. They make sure all their residents are aware of the program before it's implemented. So it's really a community-wide thing. Locally, the village of Avon has a program, the village of Honeyway Falls. A little farther out, we work with the city of Batavia, the town of Irondequoit. So more and more communities are getting on board with deer control, mostly because the deer population is very high in many areas and they realize they need to do something. So that's pretty much what I had. I was hoping to leave, some time for questions from people. Because I know, a lot of people have certain scenarios they might have questions about or have had problems on their properties. So at this point, I'll open it up to any questions that you might have.
Yes, so I have a farm and not frequently. Once in a while you find deer out of season that have been injured and are clearly suffering. What is the legality of putting that deer down without a season, without a tag?
Right, so what you could do in that situation is call an environmental conservation officer or call our wildlife office. And we can either have an officer come out and dispatch the animal if they're available. There's so few of them that it's hard to get somebody to respond right away, and then you don't know if the animal will be there. So it's a little tricky. Or sometimes we can authorize the landowner to take that animal, to dispatch it, put it out of its misery. Yeah, that's a good question, because it does happen sometimes. Adult deer cannot be rehabbed. I just want to let you know that, because capturing an adult deer can cause so much stress to that animal. It's called capture myopathy. They can actually die from the stress itself. So we never chemically immobilize and move an adult deer to a rehab facility.
What do you recommend for addressing woodpeckers?
That's a great one. So woodpeckers are protected by the Migratory Bird Act. So because they don't just stay here, they cover many states. There's some extra precautions there, but yeah, that's a good one. The U.S. Department of Agriculture would be the folks that would deal with that, because they're a federal entity. I don't know offhand any tried and true methods for preventing them from, has this happened to you? Yeah. Do you have a log cabin or wood siding?
Well,
or
yes. Cedar siding, and the bees get in there, and then the woodpeckers come in, and
Oh, yeah. Have you tried treating for the bees?
yes,
Yeah, and the woodpeckers still.
yeah, mixed results. Yes.
Is it? I mean, they are going after the insects,
Yeah,
so if
yeah.
you can get the insects under control, that's probably your best bet. Yeah. Other question?
So, deer wasting. That's my one question, how big of a problem is it in this area? And the second is, how does that impact safety of venison? For consumption?
Chronic wasting disease?
Yeah.
So fortunately, we have not found it here in New York. Since 2005, there was an outbreak near Rome and Utica, but it was quickly contained. It started at a captive servant facility, a deer farm, basically. And the DEC responded very quickly, was able to cull the deer from around that facility. We've been testing deer in New York ever since, hunter-killed deer in the fall. Every year we test about 3,000 deer across the state and have not found it yet. We do know it's been found just 5 miles south of the New York border in Pennsylvania, so it's close. It's knocking on our door for sure, but we don't have it yet. It's difficult to detect because the chronic wasting, where the deer becomes emaciated and starts to waste away, doesn't happen until later stages. So the deer can be infected and be carrying the disease for a long time before we know it. But we always recommend that if a deer is suspected of having chronic wasting disease, that you don't consume it. It hasn't been proven that people contract the disease from eating venison, because many states out west have chronic wasting disease and there's been no link to that yet. As a precaution, we would recommend no consumption if you suspect a deer with chronic wasting disease. In New York, you can, if you're a hunter and you have a deer that you've harvested and want to get it tested, Cornell University does provide that service. I don't know what they charge offhand to get the deer tested, but it's a possibility if you wanted to do that before you consumed it. That way you wouldn't necessarily waste the meat if it was a negative test. It's a good question though. And it certainly is a concern if it does come to New York. I think it might impact a lot of hunters and their willingness to hunt deer, which could exacerbate the deer population problem too. So there's a lot of things that we're looking at with that. Any questions? And any questions from folks out? Oh, another one, Patty.
Anybody in the chat room?
Anyone chatting at all?
Video chat from the speakers up, if anybody wants to unmute, ask a question.
I don't see anyone in there, no.
No one's, okay.
Yes. Merging, so we do a lot of work looking at invasive species, like aquatic and terrestrial, but like from mammal, do you see emerging pests? Like I've heard about feral boars and a couple other ones, and I didn't know if there's any of those kind of heading our way.
Right, we've had some of the Eurasian boars, the wild boars, south of Syracuse in region 7, so not in region 8, and the US Department of Agriculture has been right on top of that very quickly and has eradicated them in New York as far as we know, but states down south certainly have problems with them, and it's scary to think that they could come to New York at any time because they are so destructive. In a short amount of time, they can root up, large acreages. They're very hard to track and contain once they get established. So as long as we can stay on top of those are certainly, that'll be a good thing. Another species that has been mentioned before is nutria. So they're like a beaver, they're an aquatic animal similar to a beaver, and they can be pretty destructive too. There's none that I know of in New York. We get some reports of exotic species once in a while, but typically we find out they're just someone's pet that escaped because there's so many exotic pets that are allowed to be, possessed in New York. But those are the main ones I can think of right now. Okay. Yeah.
I have a message, but it has a chance, but we haven't done it. See it?
I like chat one.
Well, that's the
That's
one.
you? Oh, okay. Or visit our DEC. A ton of information on there about nuisance wildlife and ways to prevent wildlife conflicts, and I'm sure you'll learn a lot by reading some of that.
Thank you very much.